Hey everyone. In this episode, I talked to Wendy Morgan, a psychotherapist and an educator of nearly 20 years at Fleming College in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada. And we spend the whole episode talking about expectations, i.e., what we want or need, versus reality, what's actually happening. She shares with us an expectations framework that she's created by bringing bits and pieces in from various models that she's learned over the years to create not a tool, but a lens through which her patients can learn to understand their own expectations versus their realities and the emotions that live in that gap. Emotions like anger, frustration, disappointment, and resentment. In this expectations framework, Wendy explains the differences between our expectations of others' expectations of us, and the expectations we have of ourselves in relation to other people. And we explore how this expectation versus reality experience shows up at work and in our personal lives, like our marriages and our friendships. We also learn one very important distinction, something I found so simple but fascinating, that telling someone what you want them to do is not setting an expectation. That's just communicating a task. And she explains how an expectation is very different from communicating a task and how that can get us all kinds of tangled up. So I hope you enjoy the show. Hi, Wendy.
Hi, Zovig. So nice to see you.
You too. I'm so glad to have you here for so many reasons, but mostly because, well, one, because talking to you is always interesting, but because you do for a living something that I had aspired to do when I had graduated college, which was become a psychotherapist. I went in a different path. That is what you do. And so your training and knowledge and experience are endlessly fascinating because, as my listeners know, therapy is something that I am a wholehearted advocate
Mhm.
for. So I'm so happy to have you here. Could you just share a little bit about what you do so listeners know who we're talking to?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for having me on, Zovig. Yeah, so I am a psychotherapist. I have a private practice. I work with couples and individuals. But doing this kind of work is actually a second half career piece. I've been an educator for a long time. So I work in post-secondary education in Ontario, Canada. And a lot of the courses that I teach have a real connection to the impacts of trauma on our brains, neurodevelopment. I'm basically just a big brain nerd. And so I bring my fascination with the brain to the work that I do in my teaching. I teach in child and youth care, social service work, mental health and addictions. So when I was looking for that second piece to add on, as I was kind of coming into this latter part of my career, psychotherapy was a really natural extension for me. And so it means that I'm also a psychotherapist who brings a bit of myself as an educator into the therapy room. And now I find I'm bringing a bit of my psychotherapy self into the classroom as well. But in both places, the lens is the brain. The lens is sort of thinking about the ways that we can learn about ourselves to help us be better people. So that's sort of just a
Yeah.
little bit about me.
Yeah. So I think it's really valuable to have you on the show because as a coach, as an executive coach, and as a psychotherapist, there are some lines that we walk in parallel ways. Now,
Absolutely.
in coaching, when you are trained, it is sort of pounded into you that you are not a therapist and that we do not resolve things like trauma. We do not spend the majority of our time sort of in the past and looking at how the past has informed the present. We spend more of our time in the present, but things from the past do show up. And so there
Yeah.
are moments, many moments, especially with clients that I work with long term, where we're walking the line between what could be the executive coaching side, and then we sort of skim that surface of what could potentially be seen as therapy. And in fact, I've had clients and people who are interested in coaching ask, what is the difference between what you do and what a therapist does? And I'm very clear on sort of those lines and where my training and experience and knowledge ends and where yours would begin. But we do see people with their layers sort of peeled back. And in my work as a coach, I very often get asked by my clients for tools or frameworks to help them have hard conversations or do better at their work or in the office with other people. People are always sort of looking for these step by steps and how to's. And what I regularly see is, I used to dole those out very frequently and happily, but I noticed that they weren't using them. And then I realized it's because there's always something behind the action that's getting in the way from them even applying the tools, right? So my first question is always, well, what do you think you're going to get if I give you this tool? And we usually get into something a little bit deeper, which is where I really love to go. But when you started sharing with me about this particular, I guess we call it a framework, an expectations framework, you started sharing this with me. And I thought, well, this is something that feels immediately understandable and would not necessarily require a person to resolve a bigger issue before being able to apply this framework. In fact, it might help them resolve some of the issues, right, around relationship, connection. And the one other parallel I want to mention that I want to have you talk about this framework is that the stuff that shows up for people at work is also the stuff that shows up for people at home. We are who we are everywhere. And I know that we get better at managing ourselves and, controlling our behaviors or our responses to things depending on the environment or the people, but we are who we are. And so I'm not surprised that there are so many parallels between what I do and what you do. All of that said, this expectations framework, can you talk to me a little bit about how you created this? It's sort of an adaptation from several models that exist, but you've sort of brought them together in a really special way. So please share a little bit about this framework with us.
There's so much in what you just said that I just love. And yes, absolutely. I should make it clear too, that, my husband is actually an executive coach. And so me as a psychotherapist and him in the work that he does, we often find ourselves having conversations about how deeply connected some of this work is, because it is all about how we bring ourselves into what we do, whether that is inside of a work relationship or inside of a personal relationship, because at the end of the day, it does all come down to relationships. And that's one of the biggest pieces. You asked about how this has come together. And I have realized as I'm coming into my, half century age here, that I am a gatherer of things. And there was someone I saw speak once who described herself as a magpie. And that has always really resonated with me, because magpies, if you don't know, are birds who collect shiny bits. They collect buttons and pieces of wrapper, and they decorate their nests with these little pieces of glitteriness, shiny baubles. And she used that as a way to describe how she shares information with people as a knowledge translator. It's like taking all the best bits of things and bringing them forward. And so, yes, a lot of the work that I do is about what are the shiniest little bits of information I've taken over my 50 years of life and learning, the things that I think are really valuable. And this piece that I want to share with you today is one of those. It is one of my shiniest bits that I have just found so immensely helpful. You also talked about that piece about tools and strategies. And I hear you. Same thing I see in the therapy room. People want to come in. They want to say, give me a checklist. Give me something for my toolkit. Give me something that I can do that is going to make everything better. And of course, we desperately want to be able to do that. And I know what that feels like, to want to have that. Like you, I have realized, and I've got some things in my toolkit that I bring out from time to time, but most of the time, what I'm doing is bringing not tools, but lenses, bringing different lenses through which we can look at things that we've experienced in the past, things that we are going through now, things that are coming at us from the future. So instead of these are things I must do, there are different ways to look at what's already happening. Mm-hmm. And for my own life, I've found that to be much more helpful. And I think it is more helpful for folks going forward, because a tool it's a flash in the pan. But a lens can be something that you can really put in front of things for a long period of time. So this particular this lens about expectations and the role that expectations play in our life, it comes from two places. So two ways that this has sort of like emerged in my life. And the first was something that a therapist once said to me many, many years ago that has just absolutely stayed with me my entire life. And it's something that my husband and I refer to all the time. And it is just this very simple idea that when we think about so many difficult emotions, so things like frustration, anger, resentment, that those emotions live between two places: reality and expectation.
Mm.
The farther apart reality and expectation are, the greater those feelings of anger, frustration, resentment become. And the closer together reality and expectation are, the less those emotions, and we can diminish the sensation of those emotions. Now, we can't always move things. We can't always move reality. Sometimes we can do things to shift reality. But what we always have some level of control over is expectations, certainly our own expectations. And so that was many, many years ago that piece came into being. And then more recently, and this piece comes from what's called the traumatic incident reduction protocol. And it's a protocol that's actually helpful for folks who are exploring trauma from their past. And that's how it was presented to me. But I realized it felt so immediately connected to this concept of reality and expectation. It felt like the next level. And that's the piece that I'm hoping to share today. Mm-hmm. I realized that it has so much potential for shifting how we can actually behave in the moment. And so as a protocol for going through past trauma, it's a very complex process. What I have really pulled out for me and what I use with clients is just really simple, a sort of a 3x3 chart. I think we were joking at one point, Zovig, about how much we love a good 3x3 chart. So yes, this is something that you can pull out to show people and talk through, but it's not actually a tool. It's a lens, right? It doesn't actually tell them what to do or give them a task. It's just a lens to look at things. Mm. So yeah, go ahead.
No, continue, please.
I was just going to say that this piece is the framework that we can use, the lens that we can put in front of folks to explore all kinds of different things. And it's a lens that is helpful in personal relationships, in work relationships, in parent-child relationships. It is universal. And that's one of the reasons that this particular piece is something that whether you're doing coaching work or doing more intense relational trauma work, it's valuable.
Okay. So I am going to share a link to this lens. So I'm not going to call it a framework anymore. I'm going to call it a lens. I will share a link to it so that anyone who's listening who wants to look at it can get the details. But could you, from a sort of broad strokes perspective, can you explain what's in this lens, what's involved? And I do want to come back to the lens versus tool, by the way, because I think it's a really great point. So we'll put a pin in that, but please explain the lens itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So if, for those of you who might be able to pull it up and are looking at it, you're going to see a 3x3 grid. But even if you're not, you can imagine that in your mind. And so across the top, and this is all about expectations. This is a lens through which to consider the expectations that are constantly flowing around us, right? And we have to remember that expectations play a huge part in how we move through the world. Our employers have expectations of us. We have expectations of our employers. So you can think about this as like an inflow and an outflow, right? So at all times, there's an outflow of expectations that I have of others, and at all times, there's an inflow of expectations that others have on me. Now, the third category here is kind of the really important one, and that's the internal expectations. So what are the expectations I am holding of myself because of that relationship? You might be thinking, what on earth does that mean? Think about it this way. We have very different expectations of ourselves when our mother's coming to visit than when our partner's coming home from work or when our best friend is coming by, right? So our expectations of self shift dependent on the relationships that we have with others. So that's what goes across the top. Outflow, inflow, internal. What do I expect of you? What do you expect of me? What do I expect of myself because of you? Okay. Now, down the column are three really important questions to consider. The first is about identification. Do I actually know what I'm expecting from that person? Does that person know what they're expecting from me? And do I hold awareness of my own expectations because of that person? So have they been identified? Do we even know what expectations are under the currents? The second thing is communication. So if we have identified what those expectations are, have they actually been openly and honestly communicated? Think about how many times there are issues in the workplace. There are issues inside of relationships because one person had an expectation that was hidden.
I can think of so many of those moments for myself, Wendy,
Yeah.
and I can think about how that shows up in pretty much every single coaching session I have. There is an unmet, first of all, unspoken expectation that is then an unmet expectation. And oftentimes I find we're not even aware of our own expectations, of my outflow. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm going to speak a sentence that I speak in therapy all the time that changed my life when I heard it for the first time. Unspoken expectations are always future resentments.
Say it one more time for the people in the back.
Unspoken expectations are always future resentments.
Okay.
So if we don't speak into existence what our expectations are and they're not met, we will be let down.
I want to ask one question, and I don't want to interrupt you sort of finishing this 3x3 grid, but speaking our expectations, doesn't that then require some level of self-reflection so that we are even aware of our own expectations? Because I find that sometimes the expectations are so old and so embedded in our bones of just, this is how life is. This is how it works. And that's where the sentence is like, well, they should know, right? They should know that this is what I want. And they're so it does require some level of self-awareness to even know that, one, I have an expectation, and two, this is specifically what it is. And I haven't said it out loud.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's part of this.
It is absolutely a part of this. And so this lens is about doing that self-reflection. It's about being able to explore what are those pieces that are hiding beneath the surface.
Okay.
And you are so correct that in a lot of our relationships, those expectations are deep and hidden, and we've held them for a long time, so long that we don't actually know that they're there. One of the pieces to consider is that when we're talking about working relationships in professions, this is a place where theoretically we should be much better at this, right?
Mm,
We should be able to have much clearer, we should be able to have an expectation that expectations are discussed,
right. Okay. Yeah.
right? But self-reflection is a huge piece of this work. And I think to your much earlier point about working in parallel, whether you're doing professional coaching or personal therapeutic work, because so much of it does come down to expectations. So we end up in this swimming in the same sea, right?
Yeah. So you covered the top row, which is the outflow, the inflow, and the internal expectations I have. And then you've covered the column, which is 1, identify, 2, communicate. And what's the third piece of that 3x3?
And the third piece, and this is again, just like that internal one is the really tricky one to grapple with. The third row here is about capacity. So it's about having and holding willingness to explore whether or not the person you have expectations of actually has the capacity to meet your expectations. Do you have the capacity to meet the expectations they hold of you? And then internally to be reflecting on how capable am I of meeting my own expectations?
So capacity means capability or ability. Is that what you mean by capacity?
Yes, but it can also just mean remembering that capacity is an ever-changing reserve, and that I might have a whole lot of capacity today to do X, Y, or Z, but tomorrow, if I have a migraine or if I have a sick child, I might not have the same capacity that I have today.
Mm-hmm.
If there's something major happening in the workplace and there's a huge event going on, I'm going to have a different level of capacity than normal to get my typical pieces done. So just recognizing that capacity is constantly shifting. So it's not just about ability to do,
Mm-hmm.
it's about capacity to achieve.
Capacity to achieve. Okay. So expectations. Since we did talk a little bit about our own awareness of our expectations, because I think we can be pretty aware of others' expectations sometimes more readily than we are of our own, because it's so we're in our own jar. We often can't see the label. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about where expectations might come from, just to give people a sense of, okay, well, if they're questioning now, listening, well, what expectations do I have? Where might they look within themselves for their own expectations? How does one discover their own expectations?
So looping right back to that piece around engaging in that self-reflection piece, it is so often about slowing things down and taking time to pause and consider how and why you might be responding the way that you are, and to be curious about how and why others are responding in that moment too.
Oh. I mean, that's so right there. There's that is a complete sentence right there. You say so much with that, the slowing down, the pausing, and getting curious about yourself and the other person.
If you can bring curiosity to most things in this life, you can find ways to compassion. Curiosity is such an important ingredient to get to that compassion piece. I wonder if like an example would be really helpful.
That'd be great.
Like as a way to sort of like think about what this looks like. Because I always find, you're sort of like, theoretically, this sounds good, but what does this actually mean? Because I would want you to know that this is a lens that I literally bring out inside of therapy sessions all the time. And we'll say, like, together with the client, let's push this through the expectations chart.
Okay.
Whatever the thing is that's happening. So I'm going to give you an example from therapy. And then I'd love, because I think that you can probably really quickly think of one that would work from a coaching perspective.
Yeah.
So this is a couple that I've worked with, and they're struggling with. They've been struggling with communication pieces, and it's early days, and we've just started talking about some of these frameworks. And so they've been working through the basics, and are just in the phase of practicing, trying to slow things down, and consider what's happening, and to then bring the places that they see challenges back to the therapy room so that we can explore them together. And so they come in one time, and she says, I thought I was doing so well. I had an expectation. I realized I had it. I shared it. And then he didn't, and then he still didn't meet it. I said, okay, well, tell me a little bit about what that was. So, young couple, new home, and she grew up in an environment where her house was always neat as a pin. Mm-hmm. And her parents were coming over to see their new home for the first time. And she's been working really hard to keep everything tidy and clean. And so she sends a text to her husband that says, can you please mow the lawn? And he says, he looks outside, he realizes, oh, I just mowed it 5 days ago. It's still good. And so he types back, all good. I did it 5 days ago. It's all good. But it's the middle of summer and grass is growing quickly. And that wasn't what she needed. So she came in, and they're both there in session, and she's upset because she stated the expectation, but then he didn't meet it. But what we were able to explore was she'd identified a task. She hadn't actually identified an expectation. The task was, can you mow the lawn? He looked outside. Lawn looks great. I don't need to do it. He's feeling like, oh, I've done what I need to do. Amazing. Check that off. What she actually needed to say, if she was truly identifying the expectation, was, honey, I know that you just mowed the lawn 5 days ago, and I know that this might sound a little bit irrational, but my parents are coming for the first time, and oh my gosh, it would make me feel better if the lawn had literally just been mowed so it was like perfect. Do you think you could do that for me? It's a very different thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And all of a sudden we're identifying that the expectation wasn't of her husband to mow the lawn. The expectation was something hidden in herself, that her house be perfect before her parents come in. That's a perfectly normal and natural thing to have, if that's the experience you've grown up in. But we had to do a little bit of work to find the actual expectation that was hidden in there. And then all of a sudden that opened up her husband to become more curious about why that was important to her. And it didn't become about, you do this, I do this, the various tasks inside of a marriage. And it became more about a moment of connection for them to understand how big a deal this was for them both.
Okay, that's a great example. And and it's a great example because of the distinction between identifying a task versus an expectation. And I've heard this story from you before, and I remember thinking, well, she did state her expectation. I need you to mow the lawn. And I guess to some degree you could say that it's an expectation wrapped up in a task, right? Or you could also call it a request. I don't know. You could call it any number of things. But the real issue was that she needed to feel more at ease. She needed something to happen so that she could feel a certain way. And that feels like a personal expectation right? If I'm understanding this, like there was a personal, I might be conflating things, but there was a need she had internally based on her experience with her parents. It was a reflection. Like, so the way you describe the internal expectations is, I have this internal expectation of myself because of the other.
Yes.
Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And so it is, when we think about that middle row that's about communication. So remembering, first of all, we have to be able to identify what the expectations are. And so he knew that she was holding an expectation that the house be extremely clean. But what he didn't know was the expectation she was holding of herself to be the perfect homeowner, to be the perfect, keeper of the
Daughter
house.
and
Daughter.
daughter
Yes.
and daughter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And
That,
so the next piece, though, on the communication line is there's this little phrase that's often in those questions, which isn't just have I communicated them, but have I openly and honestly communicated them?
mm,
And so it's have I openly and honestly communicated all of the components of it? So, I mean, you are quite right. Mowing the lawn is a piece of the expectation, but the tag that's missing is because having a mown lawn right before my parents come is actually going to soothe my nerves, is going to make me feel better and more grounded and more capable of greeting them from the place that I want to greet them.
yeah. I do have very similar examples of experiences with my clients, of expectations unmet, unspoken and unmet, and also unidentified at work. They are often hidden within the task. And at work, it's so easy for the task to be the thing. Just as people, I think in general, we're always looking at what to do. We're so doing focused that we not forget, but sometimes we just look past or don't look at or take time to, as you said, to slow down to look at who we're being, how we're feeling, the why behind the task. And at work, when we're charged with, produce these results and make this money and, all the things that we produce, this widget, whatever it is, it's all task focused. And so there's so much missed expectation that goes on between manager and employee, peer to peer who are working on certain things, company to employee. And yet just yesterday, I heard expectation of employee to their company. I expect that my company do these things. I expect that. And so there's I would say, I would venture to guess probably every time behind those hidden expectations, there is a why. There is a why is that important to you? And that is often left unexplored. And when we start to explore the why, like as you did with your client, why is because I grew up with this. It makes me uncomfortable that my parents might see my house looking in a disarray. I want it to be perfect for them. I'm not, I have anxiety about it. There's the whys behind the whats. I think are where the real gold is. And when we can identify our why behind our expectation, well, one, we understand ourselves better. Oh, this is why this is so important to me because it means something so much bigger about who I am or what my life is or whatever. And then it helps the other person understand. So I bet that the husband in that particular relationship maybe now might see related issues that could also give his wife sort of that dis-ease, that anxiety about things where her parents are concerned. He might be able to now think out in the future and think, oh, well, this is kind of like the lawn situation, so I'm going to go ahead and take care of this for her. Or maybe I'll ask her if she'd like this to happen. So now his awareness has expanded because she
Exactly.
understood and made clear her why, like the real expectation behind the task.
So the why of things can lead us to compassion, and exploring the capacity that folks have can lead us to compassion. Think about how many times in your life you have been frustrated or angry or feeling resentful because someone hasn't done something that they said they were going to do.
Oh,
and you're stewing and you're sitting on it, and then you hear from them and you hear, my mother was unexpectedly in the hospital. I lost a pet. That I became sick. Something happened, and all of a sudden, like even just speaking it now, I can feel, that shift that you feel when the resentment turns from anger to, oh, I get it.
yeah.
I understand. That's a capacity issue. So you've recognized that the capacity wasn't there to meet your expectation, and suddenly your resentment goes, might still be frustrating that the thing wasn't done, but the anger and the resentment is gone because it makes sense that it wasn't completed. So all of these pieces, where we want them to take us is toward compassion.
Compassion for both ourselves and the other
Exactly.
I think they're equal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It has to be equal.
Yeah. So what can happen when to a person when their expectations don't match their reality? Like what are
Mhm.
some of the experiences they may have or feelings they might feel or just how might those moments drive their behavior when their expectations don't meet reality and assuming they are unaware of that the gap in between, right? What can happen?
When we think about folks who struggle with control and needing to have a lot of control over things, again, very, very rational and reasonable reasons for that to happen. But sometimes it's because there's a disconnect between reality and expectation. And perhaps another example is helpful here. A client that I work with, and this is actually a workplace example, and something that I think on some level, all of us have had some level of experience with. There's two colleagues who work very closely together, and there are a lot of projects that come down, and just over the course of their years of working together, one of them is the person who always does all of the admin components of the projects, and the other person is the person who does all of the sort of like public facing speaking out about the projects. And the one who does all of the admin is holding on to a lot of resentment because they always do all those pieces, and they feel like this other person has the easy way out because they're just doing the public speaking, forward facing pieces of it. But they've never actually had a conversation about these things. They've never actually addressed them. They've just fallen into these patterns and have, of course, then inadvertently taught one another to keep reinforcing those expectations.
Huh.
Because if I always do X inside of our relationship, you're just going to learn. I don't have to worry about X. Wendy's always going to do X. That's not, she doesn't have that expectation of me. Meanwhile, I'm sitting over here stewing, thinking, why doesn't Zovig ever do X? But we haven't actually had a conversation about it. And think about how often, in big and large ways, this kind of behavior plays out. So you ask what ends up happening to people. They end up stewing in resentment. They end up rupturing relationships that don't need to be ruptured. And they end up sometimes struggling to be able to have expectations of others. And they start to pile them just all on themselves. I'm the only one that can do this. If I want this to be done right, it's
I don't know
got to be
anyone
me
like
that does it.
Wendy. I don't know who you're talking about. I don't know anyone like that.
So many of us, right, fall into that behavior of, well, if I want it done the right way, I better just do it myself. That's an expectation issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So along the lines of what can happen to people, what can happen when I have identified my expectation, I have communicated my expectation not as a task, but as the why and what it means for me, and then still the expectation isn't met? What is the person with the expectation then to do?
You have just led me to the next amazing concept, right? Which is like expectations is always going to take us to boundaries.
Okay. Great.
Right. And so the expectation piece is the precursor to the boundaries. So this is such a great way to be thinking about boundaries. So often when folks talk about doing boundary work, they haven't done any of this pre-work of considering expectations. They're dropping boundaries down when none of this has been explored. And guess what? Those boundaries are both easy to breach and hard to hold because this work hasn't been done. If you have an example of something that you have pushed through this lens, let's say, for example, let's go back to our couple. If she had actually said to her husband, I know this is a little bit silly because I know you just did it not too long ago, but would you mind mowing the lawn before my parents come because it just makes me feel so much better before they arrive. It's helpful for me. If his response was, "You're being ridiculous. Don't be like that." No, I'm not doing it. I don't care how you feel. Or some version of something like that. Then our lens has shown us that he doesn't have the capacity to meet her expectations and that she might need to put a boundary in place in order to protect herself.
Okay. So, but you also said that boundaries can be hard to hold. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because that shows up a lot for I think for everybody, but it shows up a lot in coaching, right? And boundaries also, I think people often think boundaries are like no, it's a hard no. But I think there are other versions of boundaries that we might be able to explore. But can you say then, can you just say a little bit more about the boundaries?
Yeah. Boundaries is one of my favorite things to talk about.
Yeah.
I will admit, I am someone who feels that in our current sort of like pop psychology landscape, there's a lot of talk about boundaries, and sometimes that talk is quite performative. Boundaries as performance. I am drawing this line right here about what you will not do. And it to me in my mind, when I hear that kind of flavor, it feels like the person is saying, "So come on."
Yeah,
cross my boundary.
It's rebellious flavor, like I'm going to show you kind of moment.
Yep. So here's the line. I dare you to cross it. And that's not actually a boundary. Boundaries are fluid. Boundaries move with us. Boundaries are actually for us to protect ourselves. So if someone is coming and it looks like they're going to breach our boundary, one of the ways we can protect it is to actually back up. We take our boundaries with us. They live within us. So let's go back to this colleague who has the friend the colleague rather who does all of the outward facing work while she does all the admin lifting. We had a conversation once about setting a boundary where she had said, "I'm setting a boundary. I'm just going to say I'm not doing any more admin work. That's my boundary." Mm-hmm. That's not actually a boundary.
Not a boundary. Yeah.
That's not a boundary.
Yeah.
A boundary would be having a conversation about potentially sharing the load of the administrative work, explaining why sharing that load is important to you, exploring the other person's capacity to pick up some of that administrative work, and then identifying, and consequence even feels like a heavy word here with a lot of connotation, but identifying what the reality is if that isn't picked up. And so it could be for the consequence of the boundary breaching is actually inside of her to live with the reality that maybe the project doesn't get done to her level of internal expectations. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is sort of like an origami bird unfolding, like all of these pieces like connect into each other.
Yeah. I have seen so frequently where people they have these expectations that kind of show up as these, as you say, I like the word performative boundary. This is what I expect. This is what I will not allow to happen. Yet their expectations are rarely, if ever, met. And then they keep putting the expectation out there, or they think they're putting the expectation out there. And then they continue to be disappointed over and over again. And then their boundary gets crossed over and over and over again. And I think that recognizing, when does a person decide for themselves, I'm done here, I'm complete. My expectations are not being met. I've done whatever I can do, or to the best of my ability, I've expressed my expectations. I keep letting my boundaries go. When does a person decide to walk away from something, either a circumstance or a person or a place?
It's again, all with that pause, that self-reflection, and all of this work, this piece that you're talking about here lives in that internal column.
Mhm.
right? So what you're kind of identifying here, Zovig, is that, so a lot of folks, they can start doing this kind of work and they get competent at identifying the outflow and the inflow expectation piece, but they are resisting looking at that internal expectation piece. What am I expecting of myself because of this situation, because of this relationship? And so again, the two colleagues, the one doing all the admin and one doing all the outward facing stuff, what she's expecting is that the admin stuff is always completed to her level of perfection in order to have the project go off without a hitch. So there's an expectation, an internal expectation of perfection.
Right.
And how many of us hold that?
Check.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really, really hard
Yeah.
to let go of those pieces.
It is hard to let go, period.
Hmm.
And
these are internal boundaries that we're setting for ourselves, right? Those are the hardest boundaries to set.
That the internal reflection, the internal understanding of what my boundaries are, or not my boundaries, what my expectations are of myself, I think can be some of the hardest work we do. Turning the camera to face ourselves, putting the mirror in front of our face, or whatever metaphor you want to use, is some of the hardest work. And it is very easy to identify others. What's wrong with this? What's wrong with you? Okay, maybe I made a mistake here. Like, I hear that a lot. Well, maybe I made a mistake, or maybe I misunderstood. And it's like, well, no, you did. It's not a maybe. And I've done that too. Well, maybe I made the looking at our own expectations means that sometimes we have to face things that are not comfortable, like my parents make me nervous when they come to visit. That's not a thing that I would assume. I'm going to guess. I don't know for sure, but I'm going to guess that this particular client, at least the wife, it's not easy for her to face that her parents, it freaks her out. And she has big feelings about it, because maybe she, in other situations, is so very calm and so very collected and so, cool as a cucumber and can handle anything. But then in this circumstance, there's a different part of her that comes out. And looking at that moment where I'm not usually like this. This isn't usually how I am. It's so hard for people who see themselves as not even perfectionists, but just effective in their lives, right? To see themselves kind of breaking a little bit, breaking apart a little bit in those moments. Yeah. To identify, this is why I feel this way. And to move through the friction that it creates, to look at ourselves and go, I have this fear, I have this insecurity, I have this whatever, I have some anxiety about this. It's that internal self-reflection and identification of those expectations, I think would be one of the toughest part of this experience. Would you agree? Is that accurate from your perspective?
It is absolutely accurate, because when we don't meet our own expectations of self, that is very, very close to the shame button.
Yeah. And shame
is heavy, is hard, is uncomfortable. And so for perfectionists and recovering perfectionists, that means that unmet expectations lives right next to a very full bucket of shame that can come tipping onto you very quickly.
Yeah.
This, I think, though, Zovig, is one of the reasons why this conversation across the divide of coaching and therapy is so interesting to me. Because if you think about when folks are coming for coaching, the reason it so often feels like therapy is that when the coaching is really good, it's about them exploring these internal pieces. Yeah. Even though those internal pieces are related to their self as a professional person.
Yeah.
Right. But there's no clean line. As you said at the beginning, there's no clean line between this is Wendy at work and this is Wendy as a person. This is Wendy. This is Zovig. We bring all of ourselves into everything that we do. But it's this internal piece. It's this It's this self-reflection piece that is both so intensely gratifying, but incredibly scary.
Yeah. So this piece about shame, I mean, I feel like we're doing the thing I call it doorknob psychology, when you're just about to leave the therapist's office and you put your hand on the doorknob and you go, "Oh, and by the way," and you say the one thing that really needed to be looked at for the whole hour that you didn't say. This is where I feel like we're going with this, but that's okay because it doesn't mean I can't have you back. But we talked about sort of that fine line between our expectations of ourselves and how it might tip over into shame. And you mentioned a few times earlier self-compassion. I'm curious if you can just share how self-compassion and self-acceptance play a role in managing our expectations and or dealing with the disappointment when they're unmet.
I want to take us back to when we were talking about how quickly the sensation of anger and frustration dissipating comes when you get an explanation for why someone hasn't done something that is a really legitimate and reasonable expectation. I don't know about you, but I know what that feels like. It's like I've been
I have stories
frustrated.
in my head of moments where
Yes.
I've had that happen.
Then the details come and you go, oh, like it's like it just dissipates. And that same feeling of dissipation, that's compassion. That is compassion that you're feeling toward that other person. You can actually turn that in toward yourself. It's hard, but you can learn to look at a situation and realize, I did the best that I could. I'm going to take a big step back and look at all the other things that are happening in my life that might explain why this one thing in this work context really fell apart. Or I'm going to take a step back and look at the context of my work life and realize, ooh, that might have fed into why that work piece. And being curious about all the parts of ourselves and what's going on can help us to turn that compassion inward. And there's fascinating neuropsychology behind this. Compassion releases a neurohormone that actually soothes our nervous system. Mm. We all tend to know the hormones of, adrenaline and cortisol, and we talk about those. But there's one called GABA, and it's what is released when we feel compassion. It's what's released when we feel an amazing amount of empathy and understanding for another. And we can learn to shift that onto ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's where this gets easier. That's where we can actually bring that perfection bar down to somewhere that's attainable.
Yeah. Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for that. It's a great place for us to pause. Wendy, thank you so much for being here, for explaining this concept of expectation versus reality and the gaps and how to work through that in such an accessible way. I like accessible explanations of things like this because these can be complicated, right? They can be complicated and kind of heady. So thank you for that. And I will share the lens of the expectation sort of framework. I will share that with listeners in the show notes, and where you can find Wendy if you're interested in connecting with her. And until next time, we'll see you in another couple of weeks. I hope you all take good care of yourselves, lots of love and big energy, and we'll see you soon.